November 30th, 1916. 4:47 a.m. The Somme, France. Unteroffizier Klaus Weber pressed his face against the frigid mud wall of the German second-line trench, his breath forming clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. The 23-year-old Bavarian had survived 4 months of the Somme offensive, watching British attacks shatter against reinforced concrete and wire like waves against a seawall. He'd seen artillery barrages that lasted days, infantry charges that left thousands dead in minutes, gas attacks that turned men's lungs to liquid. But nothing in his 18 months of war had prepared him for what was about to emerge from the British lines 200 yards away. In the communication trench behind Weber's position, Private Heinrich Müller was writing what would be his final letter home. His hands shook, not from cold but from something he couldn't name, a primal unease that had settled over the entire company during the night. The British had been unusually quiet for 3 days. No major artillery, no probing attacks, just the occasional machine gun burst and the standard harassment fire. Veteran soldiers knew that British silence meant British planning. What they didn't know was that 40 men of the British Special Brigade were making final preparations for a weapon that would change trench warfare forever, a weapon that couldn't be stopped by wire, couldn't be suppressed by machine gun fire, and turned the strongest defensive position into a crematorium. The flamethrower, or Flammenwerfer, as the Germans who invented it called it, had existed since 1901. German forces had used portable flamethrowers in limited attacks since 1915, creating terror but achieving limited tactical success. The weapons were heavy, dangerous to operate, and had ranges measured in yards, not the hundreds of yards that rifles and machine guns commanded. But British military intelligence had been studying every flamethrower attack, every German tactical report they could capture, every terrified account from survivors, and they'd concluded something that would prove devastatingly correct. The weapon's psychological impact far exceeded its physical destructive power. Captain Vincent, commanding a company of the Special Brigade, checked his watch in the assembly trench. 4:50 a.m. In 10 minutes, his flamethrower teams would advance. Behind him, 40 men struggled with equipment that weighed over 70 pounds each. The portable flamethrower, Mark I, a British copy of the German Wechselapparat. Each device consisted of 2 cylinders containing 3.5 gallons of fuel oil mixed with tar, a compressed nitrogen propellant system, and an ignition mechanism that used a hydrogen pilot light. The theoretical range was 25 yards. In practice, against a defensive position, the psychological range was infinite. The fuel mixture was critical. Pure gasoline burned too quickly, creating flash without sustained heat. The British had developed a mixture of heavy oil, coal tar and petroleum that burned at ~100 degrees Fahrenheit and stuck to whatever it touched, continuing to burn for up to 2 minutes. This mixture, designated Flame Compound No. 3, had been tested extensively on replicas of German defensive positions built behind British lines. The tests had been classified secret not because the weapon was particularly complex, but because the results were so horrifying that military authorities feared public backlash if the details became known. Sergeant Thomas Wick, one of the flamethrower operators, had volunteered for the Special Brigade without knowing what the assignment entailed. When he'd first seen the training demonstrations, he'd vomited. Now, after 6 weeks of drill, he'd become mechanically proficient at something his mind still refused to fully accept. The target was a section of the German second-line trench, known to British intelligence as Trench Section 47B, a reinforced position with concrete machine gun emplacements, deep dugouts capable of sheltering 200 men, and overlapping fields of fire that had stopped 3 previous British attacks cold. Artillery had proved ineffective against the deep German positions. Gas attacks were unreliable in the shifting winds of the Somme. Infantry assaults resulted in predictable slaughter. The flamethrower represented a new approach, using terror and physics rather than explosives to break a position that conventional weapons couldn't crack. At 4:55 a.m., British artillery began a carefully orchestrated barrage. Not the massive bombardments that preceded major attacks, but precision fire directed at specific German positions 300 yards behind the front line. To the German defenders in Section 47B, this seemed like another harassment barrage, uncomfortable but survivable in their deep bunkers. What they didn't realise was that the artillery was deliberately avoiding their positions, ensuring that defenders would remain in the forward trenches rather than taking cover in the rear. Lieutenant Franz Becker, commanding the platoon holding Section 47B, ordered his men to stand to in the fire bays. Standard procedure during British artillery was to keep a skeleton crew in the trenches while the bulk of the men sheltered in the bomb-proof dugouts. Becker, a veteran of Verdun, positioned his men with practiced efficiency. 2 machine gun teams in the concrete pillboxes, riflemen spaced at 15-foot intervals, grenade throwers in the traverse bays, ready to bomb any British troops who made it across no man's land. The position had been built by German engineers over 6 months, incorporating every lesson learned from 2 years of trench warfare. The main trench was 8 feet deep with a fire step allowing defenders to shoot while remaining protected. The parapets were reinforced with sandbags, wooden beams, and corrugated iron. The dugouts, carved 20 feet into the chalk, had multiple entrances and could withstand anything except a direct hit from the heaviest artillery. Barbed wire stretched 30 yards deep. In front of the position, wire that previous British attacks had failed to cut despite days of shelling. Behind the wire, the ground was churned mud studded with shell holes, offering no cover. Machine gun fire lanes had been carefully plotted to create interlocking fields that made any advance across open ground suicidal. This position had been attacked 3 times. 3 times the British had been repulsed with horrific casualties. At 5 m.a.m. the British artillery ceased. In the sudden silence, German defenders tensed, fingers on triggers, eyes straining into the darkness. This was the moment when British infantry typically emerged from their trenches, advancing in waves that German machine guns would cut down with mechanical efficiency. Becker raised his whistle, ready to signal his machine gunners the instant he saw movement. What happened next would be described in German after-action reports as an attack by flame devils, an assault that violated every understanding of how warfare was conducted. The first indication was not visual but auditory, a strange hissing sound, like steam escaping from a massive engine. Then, 25 yards in front of the German wire, flames erupted from the darkness. Not the brief flash of an explosion, but sustained streams of liquid fire that arced through the air like rivers of light. The flamethrower teams had crept to within 25 yards of the German position during the artillery barrage, using shell holes for cover. Now, at a signal from Captain Vincent, they opened their valves. The pressurized flame mixture shot from the nozzles, ignited by the hydrogen pilot lights, creating lances of fire that could reach across the wire barrier that protected the German trench. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. German soldiers, who had endured artillery barrages lasting days, who had faced gas attacks and bayonet charges without breaking, froze in absolute terror. Fire is a primal fear, encoded in human evolution before humans even existed. Every instinct screamed to run from the approaching flames. Unteroffizier Weber, in the fire bay directly ahead of one flamethrower team, watched a stream of burning liquid arc toward his position. His mind, trained by months of combat to calculate trajectory and threat, simply shut down. The flame wasn't following a ballistic arc like a grenade or mortar shell. It was flowing, alive, seeking. When the burning mixture struck the parapet 3 feet from his position, it splashed, spreading across the sandbags and wooden supports. The sandbags, soaked with morning dew, began to steam and then burn. The wooden beams ignited instantly. Weber scrambled backward, forgetting his rifle, forgetting his training, operating on pure animal panic. The flame found the first German soldier 12 seconds into the attack. Gefreiter Hans Schultz, manning a machine gun position in a concrete pillbox, had his weapon trained on the approaching British when a stream of burning liquid poured through the firing slit. The flame mixture, heavier than water, flowed like a liquid, finding every opening, every gap in the fortifications. It struck Schultz across the chest and face. The tar-based mixture stuck to skin and cloth, burning with an intensity that ignited everything it touched. Schultz's scream lasted 3 seconds before the flames entered his lungs. His death was not quick. The flame compound burned for nearly 2 minutes, cooking flesh at temperatures that carbonized bone. The other machine gunner in the position, Private Otto Lang, abandoned his weapon and fled down the communication trench, his uniform smoking from proximity to the flames. Within 30 seconds, 3 flamethrower teams were pouring fire into a 60-yard section of German trench. The tactical doctrine was simple: make the position uninhabitable. The flames didn't need to kill every defender, They just needed to force them to abandon a position that had been built to be impregnable. Lieutenant Becker, training overcoming panic, tried to organise a defence. He ordered his men to throw grenades at the flamethrower operators, to use rifle fire to drive them back. Several German soldiers, operating on training and discipline rather than conscious thought, followed orders. Gefreiter Wilhelm Koch threw a stick grenade toward the nearest flame operator. The grenade fell short, exploding in no man's land without effect. Before Koch could throw another, a stream of liquid fire engulfed the traverse bay where he stood. Koch jumped from the trench, preferring to take his chances in no man's land rather than burn. German riflemen fired at the flamethrower operators, but the targets were difficult to hit in the darkness, and the British had positioned rifle teams to provide covering fire. Private James Morrison, part of the support team for flamethrower operator Sergeant Wick, shot 3 German soldiers who tried to target his sergeant. The mechanical efficiency of the operation was evident in every detail. The flamethrower teams had trained for weeks for this exact scenario. Each operator had a support team of 4 men, 2 riflemen for protection, 1 man carrying spare fuel cylinders, and 1 man with tools to repair any mechanical failures. The teams advanced in coordinated bounds, one team firing while others moved forward, maintaining continuous flame streams into the German position. The Germans were discovering a horrifying reality about defensive positions. Structures designed to protect from bullets and shells became death traps when filled with fire. The deep trenches that provided safety from artillery became chimneys that channeled flames. The dugouts with their narrow entrances became ovens. The concrete machine gun positions with their firing slits became furnaces. In the northern end of Section 47B, a group of 30 German soldiers had taken shelter in a deep dugout when the attack began. The dugout entrance was around a traverse, supposedly protected from direct fire. At 5:04 a.m., Sergeant Wick positioned himself at the top of the dugout steps and opened his valve. The stream of burning liquid poured down the steps, following gravity into the darkness below. The men in the dugout had 3 choices: remain and burn, try to escape through flames, or use one of the alternative exits. Those who tried to escape through the main entrance were engulfed. Those who fled through the alternative exits emerged into a trench now filled with smoke and scattered pools of burning liquid. Several were shot by British riflemen who had advanced behind the flamethrower teams. Others surrendered immediately, hands raised, faces blackened by smoke, uniforms smouldering. The sound of the attack was unlike anything veterans on either side had experienced. The hissing of the flamethrowers, the roar of burning materials, the screams of men on fire, and underlying it all, a crackling sound as wood, cloth and flesh ignited. Private Heinrich Müller, who had been writing a letter minutes before, emerged from a dugout to find his entire world transformed into hell. The trench he'd occupied for 3 weeks, a space that had become familiar despite its dangers, was now unrecognisable. Flames burned in multiple locations. Smoke obscured everything. The smell of burning tar, wood and flesh created a stench that made breathing difficult. He saw Unteroffizier Weber stumbling down the trench, his uniform smoking, his face showing no recognition. Müller grabbed Weber's arm, trying to lead him to safety, but Weber pulled away and collapsed. Medical examination later would reveal that Weber had suffered no burns, but his mind had simply stopped processing reality. Of the 120 men defending Section 47B, 19 were killed in the flamethrower attack itself. Another 37 were wounded, many with horrific burns that would prove fatal within days. The remaining 64 either surrendered or retreated to the third-line trench, 200 yards behind the position. The British occupied the trench at 5:14 a.m., 14 minutes after the attack began. A position that had withstood 3 major infantry assaults and countless artillery barrages had fallen in less than a quarter of an hour. The cost to the attackers was remarkably light. 2 flamethrower operators were killed by German rifle fire. 4 support team members were wounded. Not a single flamethrower malfunctioned during the operation. Captain Vincent, surveying the captured trench, was struck by the completeness of the German collapse. Rifles lay abandoned in fire bays. Machine guns sat unmanned in their positions. The trenches were structurally intact but tactically useless, filled with smoke and scattered fires. His report, filed later that day, noted that the flamethrower's primary effect was psychological rather than physical. The actual fire damage was limited to specific areas where flame had been directed, but the defenders' will to resist had been completely shattered. The German response to the attack revealed how deeply the flamethrower violated contemporary understanding of warfare. A position wasn't supposed to fall without being physically destroyed. Soldiers weren't supposed to abandon prepared defences against an enemy, armed with weapons that had a range measured in yards. Yet Section 47B had fallen because men chose potential death, in the open, over certain burning in their fortifications. General der Infanterie Fritz von Below, commanding the German Second Army, ordered an immediate investigation. His chief of staff, Oberst Hermann von Kuhl, interviewed survivors and compiled a report that reached German High Command within 48 hours. The report's conclusion was blunt. Flamethrower attacks represented a fundamental threat to the defensive doctrine that Germany relied upon. Traditional fortifications provided no protection, and possibly made defenders more vulnerable by concentrating them in confined spaces where flames could penetrate. The report recommended several countermeasures: increase spacing between defensive positions to limit the damage from any single flamethrower attack, construct alternative firing positions allowing defenders to evacuate forward trenches when flamethrowers approached, develop tactics for engaging flamethrower operators at ranges beyond their weapons' reach, issue standing orders that troops under flamethrower attack should evacuate to prepared fallback positions rather than trying to defend in place. But implementing these recommendations required time, resources, and a complete rethinking of defensive construction. In the meantime, German soldiers had to face a weapon that terrified them at a visceral level. The psychological aftermath of the Section 47B attack spread through the German trenches faster than any official communication. Survivors told their stories in whispers, each retelling amplifying the horror. The flames became walls of fire. The flamethrower operators became demons who couldn't be killed. The British were said to be deploying hundreds of the weapons, preparing to burn the German army out of its trenches. German soldiers began calling flamethrower attacks Feuerangriffe, fire attacks, pronouncing the word with the same dread they reserved for gas attacks. Unlike gas, which could be defended against with masks and chemical training, fire seemed unstoppable. You couldn't shoot through flames, you couldn't grenade them away, you couldn't shelter from them in your fortifications. The only defence was retreat, an option that German military doctrine and officer training had conditioned them to see as disgraceful. Lieutenant Franz Becker, who survived the attack on Section 47B, was court-martialed for abandoning his position. During his trial, he attempted to explain the impossible situation the flamethrowers had created. How could we defend? The flames came through the wire. They poured into our dugouts. Men were burning alive in positions we couldn't abandon. I ordered a fighting retreat to preserve my men for a counterattack. That's not abandonment. That's tactics. The court-martial board, composed of officers who hadn't experienced a flamethrower attack, found Becker guilty of cowardice. His sentence was reduced in consideration of his previous war record, but the verdict stood. This created an impossible situation for German troops. Defending against flamethrowers invited incineration. Retreating from flamethrowers invited court-martial. The British military leadership, analysing the results of the Section 47B attack, drew different conclusions than the Germans. Where German commanders saw a terrifying new weapon requiring defensive countermeasures, British commanders saw a limited tactical tool with specific applications. The flamethrower's short range made operators extremely vulnerable. The weapons were heavy, reducing mobility. The fuel load limited operation time to roughly 10 seconds of continuous flame or 80 seconds of short bursts. The flame was highly visible, marking operator positions for enemy fire. Wind could blow flames back toward operators. Rain could reduce effectiveness by dampening potential fuel sources in enemy positions. Despite these limitations, British High Command authorised expanded production and deployment of flamethrowers, not as a replacement for artillery and infantry, but as a specialised tool for reducing specific types of fortified positions. The doctrinal evolution happened rapidly. By January 1917, British tactical manuals included specific procedures for flamethrower attacks. The weapons were to be employed against concrete fortifications, deep dugouts, and positions where conventional weapons had proven ineffective. Flamethrower operators were to be carefully selected volunteers, men with steady nerves and mechanical aptitude. The training emphasized that flamethrowers were crew-served weapons requiring teamwork and coordination. An operator without his support team was helpless. The tactical employment required careful planning, reconnaissance to identify target positions and approach routes, artillery preparation to suppress enemy positions beyond flamethrower range, smoke screens to conceal operator movements, coordinated infantry assault to exploit the panic flamethrowers created, and immediate follow-up to consolidate captured positions before defenders could recover. The Germans, facing flamethrower attacks with increasing frequency through the winter of 1916 and 1917, developed their own tactical responses. Forward observation posts were positioned to detect flamethrower teams during their approach. Snipers were specifically tasked with targeting operators identifiable by their distinctive equipment. Artillery was pre-registered on no-man's land zones where flamethrower teams would have to cross. Reserve positions were prepared beyond flamethrower range, allowing tactical withdrawal without complete abandonment of the defensive line, but these countermeasures couldn't eliminate the fundamental psychological advantage the flamethrower provided. Even when attacks were repulsed, even when operators were killed before getting into range, the threat of fire attack created constant stress for German defenders. On March 12, 1917, during the preliminary operations before the Arras offensive, British flamethrower teams attacked a section of the German line near Vimy Ridge. This attack demonstrated both the weapon's effectiveness and its limitations. The target was a heavily fortified position designated Hill 135 by British intelligence, a dominating height with concrete machine gun bunkers and underground galleries connecting multiple defensive positions. Previous attacks had been repulsed with heavy British casualties. The artillery bombardment preceding the attack lasted 36 hours, heavier than necessary for a limited operation but designed to crater the ground in front of German positions, providing cover for flamethrower teams to approach. At 5:30 a.m. on March 12th, 12 flamethrower teams advanced under cover of smoke shells. The Germans, alerted by the smoke and anticipating an attack, opened fire with machine guns and rifles at maximum range. 3 flamethrower operators were killed before reaching effective range. 2 more were wounded, their equipment damaged and leaking fuel. But 7 teams reached positions where they could engage German fortifications. The results were devastating. A concrete bunker that had withstood direct hits from 9.2-inch howitzers was cleared in 45 seconds when flame was poured through its firing slit and ventilation opening. The German crew, 12 men manning 3 machine guns, either died from burns and asphyxiation or surrendered after emerging with their uniforms on fire. A series of connected dugouts was systematically burned out, with flamethrower operators advancing down the communication trenches, firing into each dugout entrance. The flames forced German defenders to evacuate through alternative exits, where they were engaged by British infantry following behind the flamethrower teams. Within 90 minutes, Hill 135 was in British hands. The cost was 14 flamethrower operators killed or wounded, 23 supporting infantry casualties, and approximately 200 casualties among the follow-up waves that secured the position. The Germans lost an estimated 87 dead, 156 wounded and 290 captured. More significantly, they lost a position that anchored their defensive line. But the attack also revealed limitations. Of the 12 flamethrower teams that began the operation, 5 were eliminated before getting into effective range. The weapons proved vulnerable to concentrated defensive fire. Several operators reported equipment failures, valves clogged by the cold, fuel mixture freezing in the lines, ignition systems failing due to moisture. The effective operating time was even shorter than tests had suggested. Operators found that in combat conditions, the stress and need for continuous movement meant they exhausted their fuel supply in less than a minute. After-action reports noted that flamethrowers were decisive against fortified positions, but nearly useless in open warfare. The weapons required defenders to be confined in structures or trenches. Against troops in the open, the short range and limited ammunition made flamethrowers inferior to conventional weapons. German military intelligence, having collected reports from dozens of flamethrower attacks, prepared a comprehensive assessment in April 1917. The report, distributed to all divisional commanders, attempted to reduce the mythic terror surrounding the weapons through cold analysis. A flamethrower operator carries approximately 40 kilograms of equipment, making him less mobile than standard infantry. The effective range of 25 meters requires the operator to approach extremely close to enemy positions. The operation time is limited to short bursts over 1 to 2 minutes maximum. The operator is highly vulnerable during the attack, unable to take cover or fire weapons other than the flamethrower. the weapon is ineffective against properly dispersed troops or positions with good observation and fields of fire. The report concluded with tactical recommendations. Engage flamethrower operators at maximum range before they can close to effective distance. Target operators with rifle and machine gun fire. A man carrying 40 kilograms of equipment cannot move quickly. If flamethrowers reach effective range, evacuate the affected position immediately to prepared fallback positions. Do not attempt to defend in place. Counterattack immediately after flamethrower teams withdraw, as they cannot effectively defend themselves once fuel is exhausted. These recommendations were theoretically sound, but extremely difficult to implement under combat conditions. Engaging operators at maximum range required identifying them among other attacking infantry. The distinctive equipment was often concealed or obscured by smoke. Evacuating under attack went against every instinct of soldiers trained to hold their positions. Counterattacking required reserves positioned close enough to respond quickly, which put them at risk from preliminary artillery. By mid-1917, both sides had deployed flamethrowers extensively. The Germans, who had pioneered the weapon, continued using it in both defensive and offensive operations. The British and French expanded their flamethrower units throughout 1917. The Americans, entering the war, studied Allied and German tactics and incorporated flamethrowers into their tactical doctrine from the beginning. The weapon had evolved from experimental device to standard assault tool, but it remained specialized, employed by dedicated units rather than distributed to regular infantry. The psychological impact, while still significant, had diminished as troops became more familiar with the weapons and their limitations. German soldiers in 1918 no longer panicked at the sight of flames the way troops in late 1916 had. They had learned that flamethrower attacks could be survived, that the weapons could be defeated, that operators could be killed. Yet the primal fear of fire never completely disappeared. Veterans who survived flamethrower attacks reported nightmares decades later. The smell of burning tar triggered panic attacks in men who had otherwise adjusted to civilian life. The sound of hissing gas, whether from a stove or industrial equipment, caused immediate stress reactions. The attack on Section 47B on November 30th, 1916, represented a pivotal moment in the evolution of weapons technology and tactical doctrine. It demonstrated that even the strongest fortifications could be defeated not by destroying them, but by making them uninhabitable. The lesson would be applied in subsequent conflicts with weapons far more destructive than flamethrowers. The survivors of that attack, both British and German, carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. Many, like Unteroffizier Weber, never fully recovered psychologically. Others, like Captain Vincent, went on to long military careers, applying the lessons learned in the mud of the Somme to future conflicts. The flamethrower itself evolved, becoming more reliable, longer-ranged, and easier to operate. World War II saw extensive flamethrower use in the Pacific Theatre, where Japanese defensive positions replicated many of the conditions that made flamethrowers effective on the Western Front. Vietnam saw further evolution with napalm, essentially an aerial flamethrower that delivered the same psychological impact over vastly larger areas, but the fundamental dynamics established at Section 47B remained constant. Fire as a weapon creates terror beyond its physical destructive power. Confined defensive positions amplify vulnerability to flame weapons. The psychological will to resist can be broken even when physical defenses remain intact. In 1973, a historian interviewing World War I veterans for an oral history project spoke with former Private Heinrich Müller, who had survived the attack on Section 47B. Müller, then 81 years old, had rarely spoken about his war experiences. When asked about the flamethrower attack, he was silent for several minutes before responding. "I have been burned by fire many times since the war. Cooking accidents, a house fire in 1931, industrial accidents when I worked at the factory. Each time I am back in that trench watching the flames come over the parapet. The pain of the burns is nothing compared to the memory of that morning. We thought we were safe. Our trenches were deep. Our bunkers were strong. Our wire was thick. We had stopped the British before. We would stop them again. Then the flames came, and everything we believed about safety and defense meant nothing. You cannot fight fire. You can only run. And when running means abandoning your post, means being called a coward, means facing a court-martial, you stand and wait to burn. That is what the flamethrower did. It gave us a choice between two kinds of death: the mechanical death of burning or the social death of cowardice. Many chose to burn rather than face disgrace. I chose to run. I am still not certain if that was courage or cowardice. Miller died in 1976, having lived 60 years after the war. His war diary, donated to a German military archive, contained detailed entries about his service, except for November 30th, 1916. That date had a single sentence: "Today, we learned that hell exists on Earth." The attack on Section 47B lasted 14 minutes. In that brief period, a weapon that had existed for 15 years demonstrated how technology could render obsolete defensive doctrines developed over centuries. The flamethrower didn't end trench warfare that would take combined arms tactics, tanks, aircraft, and evolving infantry doctrine, but it contributed to the growing understanding that static defense, no matter how well engineered, could be defeated by weapons that exploited physics and psychology rather than explosive force. The men who operated the flamethrowers, who walked across no man's land carrying 70 pounds of fuel and nitrogen, who stood exposed while pouring liquid fire into enemy positions, displayed a particular kind of courage. They knew they were priority targets. They knew their equipment made them slow and vulnerable. They knew that if their tanks were hit, they would die instantly, consumed by their own weapon. Yet they advanced anyway, because military necessity demanded it, and because someone had to do the job that conventional weapons couldn't accomplish. The men who faced the flamethrowers, who stood in supposedly impregnable positions and watched rivers of fire flow toward them, faced a test of courage that few other weapons imposed. Artillery could be endured in deep bunkers. Machine gun fire could be avoided by staying low. Gas could be defended against with masks. But fire demanded a choice: burn or run. That thousands chose to stand, even briefly, even when every instinct screamed for flight, speaks to the power of military discipline and the bonds between soldiers. November 30th, 1916 was not the first flamethrower attack and far from the last, but it represented the moment when the weapon transitioned from experimental curiosity to proven tactical system. A reinforced German trench line built to withstand anything the British could deliver had shattered in 14 minutes. The question that echoed through both armies' command structures was simple and terrible. If flamethrowers could break Section 47B, what position was truly safe? The answer, as subsequent operations would demonstrate, was that no position constructed according to 1916 defensive doctrine could withstand a properly executed flamethrower attack. This realization forced a fundamental reassessment of trench warfare that extended far beyond the immediate tactical implications. German defensive planning, which had dominated Western Front, strategy since late 1914, rested on a simple calculation. A well-constructed trench system with adequate machine gun coverage and artillery support could repel attacks at a casualty ratio of 10 to 1 or higher. The mathematics favoured defence so overwhelmingly that offensive operations were essentially futile unless preceded by artillery bombardments so massive they destroyed the defensive works entirely. The flamethrower undermined this calculation by making defensive strength irrelevant. A concrete machine gun bunker that could withstand direct hits from heavy artillery became a crematorium when fire poured through its firing slits. Deep dugouts that protected infantry from the heaviest bombardments became death traps when filled with burning liquid. Wire obstacles that channeled attackers into killing zones meant nothing when flamethrower operators could simply burn paths through them or bypass them entirely by approaching through shell craters. Major Wilhelm Balck, a staff officer with the German Sixth Army, prepared a tactical analysis in December 1916 that circulated among senior commanders. His conclusions were stark. The British flamethrower attacks represent a qualitative change in offensive capability that renders our current defensive doctrine obsolete. A weapon with a range of 25 metres, operated by men carrying 40 kilograms of equipment, should be easy to defeat. Yet our troops are abandoning prepared positions that have withstood days of artillery bombardment after minutes of flame attack. This is not cowardice. This is the rational response to a weapon against which our fortifications provide no protection. We have three options. First, develop effective countermeasures that allow troops to defend in place against flame attacks. Second, modify our defensive doctrine to emphasize mobility and counterattack rather than static defense. Third, accept that certain types of positions cannot be defended against flamethrowers and design our defensive lines accordingly. I submit that the first option is impossible with current technology. The second option contradicts the defensive advantages that have sustained our operations for 2 years. The third option concedes tactical initiative to the enemy. None of these options are acceptable. Therefore, we must develop our own offensive flamethrower capability and employ it before the British expand their operations. This analysis reached Oberste Heeresleitung, the German High Command, in early January 1917. The response was to accelerate German flamethrower production and to mandate that all assault divisions include dedicated flamethrower detachments. The Germans, who had invented the weapon but used it sparingly, now recognised they were behind the British in tactical employment and doctrinal development. The irony was not lost on German officers who had mocked British tactical competence earlier in the war. The British, meanwhile, were discovering the limits of flamethrower effectiveness through continued operations. An attack on January 19, 1917, near Thiepval, demonstrated these limitations dramatically. The target was a German trench system designated the Wunderwerk by the Germans, a complex series of interconnected trenches, dugouts, and tunnels that had been under construction for over a year. British intelligence estimated 400 defenders occupied the position. The attack plan called for 18 flamethrower teams to advance, following a brief artillery preparation. The objective was to burn out the forward trenches, forcing German defenders to retreat to secondary positions where they could be engaged by conventional infantry assault. The operation began at dawn on January 19th with a 30-minute artillery bombardment focused on German reserve positions and artillery batteries. At 7:15 a.m., the flamethrower teams advanced from their jump-off trenches into no man's land. The Germans were ready. Forward observers had spotted the distinctive equipment during the assembly phase. Machine gun crews had been briefed to target flamethrower operators specifically. Artillery had been pre-registered on the approaches to the Wunderwerk. The German defence was methodical and devastating. Machine gun fire opened at 300 yards, long before the flamethrowers could reach effective range. The British support teams returned fire, but the Germans had positioned their weapons in reinforced positions that were difficult to suppress with rifle fire. Within 5 minutes, 7 flamethrower operators had been killed or wounded. The survivors attempted to continue the advance, using shell craters for cover, but the German fire was too intense. At 7:28 a.m., Captain Richards, commanding the flamethrower company, ordered withdrawal. Only 4 of the 18 teams had reached positions where they could employ their weapons, and even those teams achieved limited results. The Germans had modified their defensive positions based on lessons learned from previous attacks. Firing slits on bunkers had been reduced in size and fitted with steel shutters that could be closed when flamethrowers approached. Dugout entrances had been repositioned around traverses and protected by blast walls that deflected flame. Alternative firing positions had been constructed, allowing defenders to evacuate forward positions temporarily and reoccupy them after flamethrower teams withdrew. The British casualties were severe: 11 flamethrower operators killed, 6 wounded, 19 support personnel killed or wounded. The follow-up infantry assault, launched despite the failure of the flamethrower attack, was repulsed with an additional 140 casualties. The German position remained intact. The after-action report filed by Captain Richards was blunt about the failures. The enemy was prepared for flamethrower attack and had taken specific countermeasures. Our approach was detected early, allowing concentrated defensive fire before we reached effective range. The artillery preparation was insufficient to suppress German defensive positions. The flame teams lacked adequate infantry support to suppress enemy fire. The modified German defensive works reduced flamethrower effectiveness even when teams reached attack positions. The report concluded with a recommendation that flamethrowers only be employed against positions where surprise could be achieved and where adequate supporting arms could suppress defensive fires. This was a significant retreat from the optimism that had followed the Section 47B attack. The weapon that had seemed capable of breaking any defensive position was proving to be much more limited in practice. But British tactical development didn't stop with this failure. Instead, it accelerated. Engineers studied the German defensive modifications and developed countermeasures. Longer-range flamethrowers were designed to engage targets from beyond the effective range of rifle fire. Smoke munitions were improved to provide better concealment for advancing teams. Infantry tactics were modified to provide better support for flamethrower operations. Most significantly, The doctrine evolved to emphasize that flamethrowers were not independent assault weapons, but components of combined arms operations. Artillery to suppress enemy fires, smoke to conceal movement, infantry to protect operators, and flamethrowers to break specific fortified positions. Each element was necessary, none was sufficient alone. This evolution was codified in a new tactical manual distributed in March 1917. Special Brigade Tactical Memorandum No. 7 outlined detailed procedures for flamethrower operations that reflected hard lessons learned over 6 months of combat. The manual emphasized reconnaissance and planning. Every flamethrower attack required detailed intelligence on the target position, including location of firing positions, dugout entrances, observation posts, and likely defensive responses. Approach routes had to be planned carefully, using terrain features and shell craters for cover. Artillery support had to be coordinated to suppress specific threats while avoiding friendly casualties. Smoke screens had to be positioned to conceal movement without revealing the intended attack point. The manual also emphasized training. Flamethrower operators required a minimum of 40 hours of specialized instruction before being certified for combat operations. This training included mechanical maintenance, tactical employment, coordination with supporting arms, and practice attacks against simulated enemy positions. The washout rate was high. Many volunteers couldn't handle the psychological stress of carrying 70 pounds of flammable liquid toward enemy positions or the physical demands of operating the equipment under fire. Those who completed training formed an elite within the British Army, specialists who understood that their survival depended on perfect execution of complex procedures under combat conditions. Private Arthur Henderson, who joined a flamethrower company in February 1917, described the training in a letter to his family. "They teach you to think like a machine. Every movement is practiced until it becomes automatic. How to approach a position, how to identify firing points, how to coordinate with your support team, how to withdraw if things go wrong. Most importantly, they teach you to control fear. You know that you're carrying something that will kill you instantly if hit. You know that the Germans will target you specifically. You know that your chances of surviving even a single operation are perhaps 50-50. But you cannot think about these things during the attack. You must focus on the technical tasks, check the pressure gauge, confirm the ignition is functioning, coordinate with your rifleman, identify your target, advance at the proper moment, open the valve, direct the flame, maintain pressure, observe results, withdraw. If you start thinking about what could go wrong, you freeze, and freezing means dying." Henderson survived 4 flamethrower operations before being seriously wounded in May 1917. His survival was unusual. Casualty rates among flamethrower operators remained above 30% throughout 1917, higher than almost any other specialty in the British Army. The German development of countermeasures accelerated through spring 1917. Defensive positions were redesigned to minimize vulnerability to flame attacks. Forward trenches were made shallower and wider, reducing the chimney effect that had made deep trenches so deadly. Dugout entrances were protected by multiple blast walls and angled to prevent direct flame entry. Machine gun positions were constructed with multiple firing points, allowing crews to shift positions when flamethrowers approached. Perhaps most significantly, the Germans developed their own offensive flamethrower doctrine that emphasized preemptive attacks on British positions. If the British were using flamethrowers to break German defences, the Germans would use flamethrowers to break British attacks before they could develop. On April 23, 1917, during the early stages of the Arras offensive, German assault troops equipped with flamethrowers counterattacked British positions near Monchy-le-Preux. The attack demonstrated how quickly tactical innovation could spread between adversaries. The British had captured a section of the German front line and were consolidating their position when German assault troops, including 6 flamethrower teams, launched a counterattack from the communication trenches. The British defenders, occupying German-built positions they barely understood, found themselves facing the same weapon they had used against the Germans. The psychological tables were turned completely. British soldiers who had watched German positions burn now experienced the terror of defending against flames. The attack recaptured 200 yards of trench in less than 20 minutes. The British lost 87 men killed, wounded, or captured. The German casualties were light, 7 dead including 1 flamethrower operator, and 14 wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Morrison, whose battalion had been driven from the captured trenches, filed a report that acknowledged the effectiveness of the German tactics. The enemy employed flamethrowers with considerable skill, advancing under cover of smoke and rifle fire. Our troops, unfamiliar with the captured positions and lacking prepared fallback positions, were unable to organize effective resistance. The psychological impact of the flame attack was severe. Men who had performed well under artillery fire and in infantry combat abandoned positions without orders when flames appeared. Discipline collapsed in affected sectors. The enemy counterattack succeeded with minimal casualties because our troops preferred capture to burning. This report, and others like it, forced British commanders to recognise that flamethrowers were not a unique British advantage, but a weapon available to both sides. The tactical innovation that had broken German positions at Section 47B could be turned against British troops with equal effectiveness. By summer 1917, both sides had fully integrated flamethrowers into their tactical repertoire. The weapons appeared in almost every major offensive operation on the Western Front. The Germans used them extensively during the defence of the Hindenburg Line. The British employed them during the Passchendaele Offensive. The French, who had been developing their own flamethrower designs, used them at Verdun and during the Nivelle Offensive. The American Expeditionary Force, arriving in France in late 1917 and early 1918, incorporated flamethrowers into their equipment tables based on Allied experience. But the nature of flamethrower employment had evolved significantly from the initial attacks in late 1916. The weapon was no longer seen as a potential war winner or a revolutionary technology. Instead, it was understood as a specialized tool for specific tactical situations, particularly useful against fortified positions and dugouts, highly effective in trench warfare where targets were confined, requiring extensive support from infantry and artillery to be effective, vulnerable to defensive countermeasures if surprise was lost, and limited by short range and operation time. The mythology of the flame attack, the terror that had caused entire platoons to abandon their positions in late 1916, had faded as soldiers on both sides gained experience. By 1918, troops facing flamethrower attacks no longer panicked automatically. They had learned countermeasures, fall back to prepared positions beyond flame range, use concentrated rifle and machine gun fire against operators, employ grenades against flamethrower teams when possible, and counterattack immediately after flame teams withdraw. Yet the psychological impact never disappeared entirely. Veterans of flamethrower attacks, both those who operated the weapons and those who faced them, carried psychological scars that often proved more lasting than physical wounds. German military psychiatrists treating soldiers diagnosed with war neurosis found that flamethrower exposure was one of the most common triggers for what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Ernst Siemel, a German psychiatrist working with combat trauma patients, wrote in a 1918 medical journal that flame weapon exposure created a particular type of psychological damage. The patient has experienced a situation where all normal defensive reactions are inadequate. One can take cover from artillery in a dugout. One can hide from rifle fire in a trench. One can don a mask against gas. But flame penetrates these defences. It finds the soldier in his place of safety and transforms that place into a death trap. The psychological result is a complete loss of any sense of security. The patient no longer believes that any location is safe. Even years after the triggering event, the sound of fire or the smell of burning materials can provoke immediate panic responses. Sleep is disrupted by nightmares of burning. Many patients develop obsessive behaviours related to fire safety, checking and rechecking that no flames are present. Some become unable to be in enclosed spaces, as these remind them of dugouts and bunkers where escape from flame was impossible. British medical officers documented similar patterns. Captain Arthur Hurst, treating shell-shocked soldiers at Seelhain Hospital, noted that patients who had experienced flamethrower attacks often had more severe and persistent symptoms than those traumatized by artillery or gas. The primitive fear of fire, he theorized, activated psychological defense mechanisms that were more fundamental and less amenable to treatment than fears related to other weapons. The tactical legacy of the flamethrower extended beyond World War I. Every subsequent conflict involving fortified positions saw flamethrower employment. The Japanese used them extensively during their campaigns in China in the 1930s. The Soviets deployed flamethrower tanks during the Winter War against Finland. The Germans used them during the invasions of Poland and France. But it was in the Pacific theatre of World War II that flamethrowers saw their most extensive employment, in circumstances that closely paralleled the trench warfare of the Western Front. Japanese defensive positions on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa were built with the same philosophy as German trenches, deep, interconnected, designed to withstand artillery bombardment. American forces discovered that conventional weapons were often ineffective against these positions. Artillery couldn't reach defenders in deep caves. Infantry assaults resulted in prohibitive casualties. The solution was the same one that British forces had discovered at Section 47B in 1916, flamethrowers. The M2 flamethrower used by American forces in the Pacific was a direct descendant of the World War I weapons, heavier, more reliable, with better range, but operating on identical principles. Pressurized fuel, ignition system, directional nozzle. The tactics were also nearly identical. Combined arms operations with infantry support, careful approach to effective range, sustained flame application to force evacuation or kill defenders. The results were equally devastating. Japanese soldiers, who had shown extraordinary courage and determination in defending against conventional attacks, frequently abandoned positions when faced with flamethrowers, not because they were cowards, but because the human response to fire as a weapon transcends culture and military training. When faced with the choice between burning alive or evacuation, most men choose evacuation regardless of orders or doctrine. The tactical effectiveness of flamethrowers in the Pacific vindicated the lessons learned on the Western Front 3 decades earlier, but it also highlighted the moral complexity of flame weapons. Post-war debates about the ethics of flamethrower use reflected deep unease about weapons that killed through burning, a death widely considered to be among the most painful and horrible possible. The 1980 Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons restricted flamethrower use against civilian populations and in civilian areas, though it did not prohibit military employment entirely. Modern militaries have largely abandoned portable flamethrowers, not because of ethical concerns but because other weapons, thermobaric explosives, white phosphorus, napalm, achieve similar effects with less risk to friendly forces. But the fundamental tactical problem that flamethrowers addressed, how to force defenders from fortified positions without prohibitive casualties, remains relevant. The men who fought at Section 47B on November 30, 1916, both British attackers and German defenders, experienced the introduction of a weapon that changed warfare in ways both tactical and psychological. The position fell in 14 minutes, demonstrating that even the strongest fortifications could be rendered useless by weapons that exploited human vulnerability rather than structural weakness. For the British flamethrower operators who carried out the attack, survival meant mastering fear and executing complex tasks while under fire and carrying equipment that could kill them instantly if damaged. For the German defenders who faced the attack, survival meant overcoming every instinct that evolution had programmed into human psychology and choosing rational withdrawal over instinctive defense. The broader legacy of the flamethrower in World War I was its demonstration that tactical advantage could shift rapidly when new weapons were properly employed. German defensive doctrine that had dominated the Western Front for 2 years proved vulnerable to a weapon with a range of 25 yards. This forced both sides to recognize that defensive supremacy was not permanent and that technological innovation could overturn established tactical patterns. The attack on Section 47B was studied in military academies for decades afterward, not because it was particularly large or strategically significant, but because it represented a perfect example of how a specialized weapon, properly employed with adequate support, could achieve results that conventional arms could not. The lessons learned, combined arms coordination, attention to psychological factors, importance of surprise, need for specialized training, and vulnerability of static defenses to innovative tactics, remained relevant through subsequent conflicts. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy was not tactical, but human. The soldiers who experienced flamethrower combat, whether wielding the weapons or facing them, carried memories that haunted them for the rest of their lives. In the decades after the war, veterans gathering at reunions would discuss artillery barrages and infantry charges with a certain detachment. The normal horrors of combat softened by time, but when the subject of flamethrowers came up, voices would lower and eyes would become distant. Some veterans refused to discuss it at all. The attack on Section 47B lasted 14 minutes on a cold November morning in 1916. In that brief span, 120 German soldiers learned that their fortifications could not protect them. Their training had not prepared them for this, and courage had limits when facing fire. The British soldiers who carried out the attack learned that warfare could demand things that violated every human instinct, that weapons could terrify even those who wielded them, and that victory achieved through burning had a cost measured in nightmares rather than casualties. The trench line shattered that morning was rebuilt within weeks. The tactical lessons were incorporated into doctrine and training. The casualty statistics were added to the accounting of a war that would ultimately kill millions. But for the men who were there, who watched flames pour into trenches or who carried the weapons that created those flames, November 30th, 1916 remained forever, the day they discovered that hell was not a theological concept, but a tactical reality, measured in yards and seconds, created by human hands and human decisions. In the decades after the war, Section 47B returned to farmland. The trenches were filled in, the shell holes were ploughed under, the burned timbers and melted equipment were removed or buried. French farmers reclaimed the land and planted crops in soil that had been soaked with blood and fire. Today, no marker identifies the location where 19 men burned to death, and a defensive doctrine was shattered. The attack is mentioned briefly in regimental histories and scholarly works on World War I, usually as a footnote to larger discussions of tactical evolution. But for those who were there, for the survivors who lived into the 1970s and 1980s, Section 47B was not a footnote. It was the moment when modern warfare revealed its true nature, when technology and human vulnerability intersected in ways that broke both bodies and minds. The flamethrower attack of November 30th, 1916 lasted 14 minutes. Its psychological echoes lasted lifetimes. The tactical lessons reshaped warfare for generations, and the fundamental truth it revealed, that no position is safe, no defense is perfect, and human courage has limits when facing certain weapons, remains as relevant today as it was on that cold morning more than a century ago when flames first poured into a reinforced trench line, and the world learned a new definition of terror.